But let's bring on our first guest. It's a friend of the show from the Black Agenda Report. It's Danny Haifong is here.
So, hey, Jimmy. Hey, everyone. My book is called American Exceptionalism and American Innocence, A People's History of Fake News, from the Revolutionary War to the War on Terror.
Well, it's great to see you. And whenever you're on, I always get a lot of controversy when you're on, right? Because you're a fucking China lover. And, we don't like China. In America, they're bad, and the Belt and Rail, whatever it's called, what is that called?
The Belt and Road Initiative.
That's it. That's very bad, and so there's a lot of bad things China's doing that we're gonna talk about. I mean, people go nuts when you're on the show and you talk about China. I mean, nuts.
Yeah, I'm aware.
And so it's funny. I just want people to know I show all sides of the China debate, right? So I had Matt Stoller on, and he's very hawkish on China. I think that's a fair assessment. Maybe he would quibble with that. And I had on Dylan Radigan. He was a little less that way. And then I have you, and you're way over to the left. And you're talking. You have nothing but it's a socialist utopia in China. If you talk to Danny Haifong, everything's going great, and people's needs are being met by a great multi-party government. So they've been having these starting last year. They started doing pulse protests in Hong Kong, and they're very effective because they wanted to pass a law that said that you can extradite a criminal from Hong Kong to the mainland China. They didn't want that. They like the two. So you get what's happening, right? So that actually worked. And so now, because of the coronavirus is happening, China decided to just kind of crack down. So this is the headline in The Guardian. This is the end of Hong Kong. China pushes controversial security laws. So let's get into it. China plans to push through sweeping national security laws for Hong Kong at its annual meeting of Parliament in a move that critics say will effectively end the territory's autonomy. Article 23 of Hong Kong's mini-constitution, the Basic Law, that's the proper name, the Basic Law, says the city must enact national security laws to prohibit treason, secession, sedition, and subversion against the Chinese government. So they have a part in their constitution, Article 23, that says they have to do this. They have to come up with some national security measures, right? So that's all right. So, but the clause has never been implemented due to deeply held public fears it would curtail Hong Kong's cherished rights, such as freedom of expression. An attempt to enact Article 23 in 2003 was shelved after 500,000 people took to the streets to protest. And by passing the law in the NPC, Chinese authorities will effectively bypass local opposition. According to legal experts, Chinese lawmakers may be able to enforce the law in Hong Kong through a provision, Article 18 of the Basic Law, that allows certain national laws in mainland China to be applied in Hong Kong, either through declaration or local legislation. Martin Lee, the founder of the Democratic Party and a senior barrister who helped draft the Basic Law, said he insisted on the language in the document that Hong Kong shall legislate on its own national security laws. So there seems to be a bit of a controversy about what's in the Basic Law. And this is a blatant breach of their promise. They have reversed things completely, he said. This is the wrong procedure. He said the Article 18 provision should apply to national laws only, not laws that specifically relate to Hong Kong. If this precedent is set, then there is no need for Hong Kong's Legislative Council, he said. Zhang said details of the proposal would be announced at NPC on Friday. The resolution is likely to be passed by China's parliament next week. China's announcement came as anti-government protests that have overwhelmed Hong Kong since last June approached their one-year anniversary. In recent months, the protests have been paused as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, and much of the world has been distracted. Critics say the measure severely undermines Hong Kong's legal framework established under the terms of the former British colony's handover to Chinese control in 1997. Chris Patten, the last British governor of Hong Kong, described it as a comprehensive assault on the city's autonomy. Under basic law, Hong Kong is meant to enact security legislation on its own. This spells the beginning of the end of Hong Kong under one country, two systems, said Kenneth Chan, a political scientist at the Baptist University in Hong Kong. It would mean also communist-style political struggles have trumped the rule of law and a dagger that has stabbed into the heart of the city's liberal foundations. This is an expedient way to control Hong Kong, said Johnny Lau, veteran China watcher and former journalist at a pro-China when legal observers and human rights advocates worry the law will be used to target critics of the central government. Over the last year, Hong Kong and Chinese authorities have often described demonstrators as terrorists. This is the end of Hong Kong, said pro-democracy Hong Kong legislator Dennis Kwok. Beijing, the Central People's Government, has completely breached its promise to the Hong Kong people. They are completely walking back on their obligation. Still, demonstrators who have begun to take to the streets again appear more determined to pursue their demands. So let me bring in Danny Haifong from the Black Agenda Report. So break it down. So why is this happening now? So what is the NPC? Tell me that first.
The NPC is the National People's Congress. It is the highest legislative authority in China, along with the China's People's Political Consultative Conference, which is the body which represents all of the political parties that talk about policy. Both bodies are meeting right now. The NPC and the CPP-CC are both meeting a part of their annual 2 sessions to discuss national and international policy.
So there seems to be this thing called the Basic Law. Now, and you correct me when I get something wrong. So I just want to, so we all understand what's going on, and then you can get into the weeds. So there's a thing called the Basic Law, and it was written for Hong Kong, and it says that Hong Kong has to set out its own national security procedures. But right now, China mainland is trumping Hong Kong, and they're using this other Article 18 to enforce their laws or their kind of rule and control on Hong Kong. And what the big worry is that this is really used to crack down on protesters, pro-democracy protesters, and this is going to be targeted towards freedom of speech and liberty and all that stuff. So this seems bad to someone like me. This seems bad. What is your take on it?
So to begin, we have to, when it comes to Hong Kong, we have to be really clear that Hong Kong over the course of 100+ years, from the mid-1850s to the mid-1840s to 1997, was a British colony. And it wasn't until the 1980s where China was able to negotiate and said, no, we're not going to allow an entire region of our country to be colonized by the British. So Margaret Thatcher at that time actually wanted to take military action to keep Hong Kong as part of the British colonial empire. But the British Defense Ministry said, hell no, we cannot do that. That is political suicide. So Hong Kong becomes, once again, part of China. It is actually governed as a special administrative region within the framework of the Chinese Constitution. So Article 58 of the Chinese Constitution actually gives the central government the right to enforce laws for all of its special administrative regions, but Hong Kong has a special relationship to Beijing. The Basic Law is that special relationship, which allows capitalism, especially the hyper-finance capitalism, neoliberal capitalism that exists in Hong Kong, to remain in place so long as, and this is part of the Basic Law, which should not really infuriate the Western media and the U.S. media so much, because this is actually in the Basic Law and they cite it, so long as there is not sedition, treason, or a separatist movement to occur in Hong Kong to separate it from China. Something that's perfectly reasonable when we think about how Hong Kong used to be a colony within China. So basically, what's happening right now, and what the U.S. and the British corporate media are so concerned about, is that these protests in 2019 that really jumped off in June were very violent and very right-wing in character, received a lot of backing from the National Endowment of Democracy.
So tell people who that is. Tell people who the National Endowment of Democracy is.
Right. So the National Endowment for Democracy is a large organization that was begun in 1983 under the Reagan administration to basically conduct the affairs of the CIA out in the open and in the public that the CIA used to do in private. And the National Endowment for Democracy, their principal mission is to fund NGOs and political organizations abroad to promote U.S. democracy and to protect the interests of the U.S. empire. The NED is involved not just in Hong Kong, although 2 out of the 4 principal headquarters of the NED are located in Hong Kong. And there are over 35 organizations in Hong Kong funded by the National Endowment for Democracy at the tune of tens of millions of dollars.
So people who watch the Jimmy Dore show might be familiar with the NED, because the NED is that branch of the government, that nefarious branch of the government that funds places like Bellingcat, which is that pro-war website that smears people who tell the truth about war. So they've smeared us, they've smeared everybody at the Grays, everybody who tells the truth about Syria, Afghanistan, Libya, Venezuela. Bellingcat, funded by the United States government, will smear its own citizens in the effort to push war and discredit anti-war voices. That's who the NED is, and you're saying the NED is busy in Hong Kong.
Yes, and it is principally behind these protests in Hong Kong that really jumped off in 2019. But they're in...
So if I could just, I hate to bring it, but so you think that, so we all know that the CIA or American intelligence had something to do with the protests in Hong Kong, but was the way a lot of people look at it, well, this is one of the few cases where the CIA's and the intelligence community of the United States lines up with actual democracy, and they're actually on the side of good. Now, is that wrong?
I think that is completely wrong. And if you look at the actual social character of the protests from the very beginning, these protesters were literally demanding that the U.S. intervene in Hong Kong to bring about so-called democracy, really to bring about so-called independence to Hong Kong. They were, using pro-Trump regalia, American flags. They were holding the old Union Jack and using racist slogans toward Han Chinese people to get their message across. A lot of these protesters are very close to the United States government. Martin Lee, who was cited in that article, in 2014, when the so-called Occupy Central protests were happening in Hong Kong, was lobbying the NED to bring millions of dollars to these organizations. He is a right-wing hawk who has deep relationships with Mike Pompeo and the U.S. State Department, and he is one of the principal forces trying to separate Hong Kong from China, which is not the majority opinion.
No, it's not. It's not the majority opinion in Hong Kong, you mean?
No, it is not the majority, because what separation of Hong Kong from China would mean would basically be a return to the colonial era, whereby the West has free reign to do whatever it wants. And before 1997, there were no minimum wage protections. There were absolutely no basic rights. Things like flogging existed. Public flogging was a punishment all the way up until 1997 in Hong Kong, before it became part of China proper. So not a lot of working class people in Hong Kong believe that there should be separation from China. But the social character of the protests, led by folks like Jimmy Lai, who is a media mogul, he is a 100 millionaire. He's made hundreds of millions of dollars through private media, through a tabloid called Apple Daily. These folks are principally finance capitalists, media capitalists, big capitalists who are really trying to stoke the tensions that exist between Hong Kong and China, the one country, two system policy. And a big issue with this is that a lot of these young folks who were organized by these NED organizations, they are seeing prospects diminish economically. And their grievances are being redirected toward mainland China rather than the fact that their own judicial system, which all of these Western media, U.S. media, all of these conduits of the NED love to defend, that judicial system and that governance system is actually controlled by finance capitals, literal bankers, lawyers. They are actually who comprise of the administration in Hong Kong, the local legislative administration. And they're the ones who do things like ensure that 70% of all income for workers in Hong Kong goes to rent and people are sleeping in places like coffin homes, which are micro apartments, which are only big enough for people to basically lie their heads. They can't even, they have to crawl out of these places. This is the situation in Hong Kong. That's what's causing neoliberalism, is what's causing the poverty there. But these young people are being misdirected and drawn into NED-funded organizations which have U.S. geopolitical goals at heart.
So you're saying, is it true that, how many people live in Hong Kong? Do you know?
Not exactly sure.
Steph, can you look up, is it 6 million? I know, I'll ask Suri. Hey, Suri, what's the population of Hong Kong?
As of 2019, the population of Hong Kong was 7,500,700.
So now I understand that. Is it true that those Pulse protests, I don't know if you know, I heard they got like 3 million people into the streets at some times. Is that true?
No, I've heard that the biggest demonstration was 35,000. And that was at the height of the protests. And a lot of the protests were very violent in nature, didn't target necessarily the places that we would consider to be, sources of power, but they would target elderly folks. They would target journalists. They would target, public institutions. In February, they burned a quarantine center during the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. So yeah, at the height, I believe 35,000.
BBC
from what I was
reports
reading, was
2
the biggest
million.
protest.
So the BBC reported 2 million.
Last June 2019.
Last June 2019 reported 2 million protesters. So if it was only 35,000, how would they be successful?
Well, they are a heavily organized force. Hong Kong has a lot of freedom. So this is the irony of it all. Hong Kong actually has a lot of freedom. The reason why Beijing has not stepped in up until this point is because it has given Hong Kong the freedom to legislate its own authority. But for the last 20 plus years, it has not been able to, because of pressure from forces like this, foreign-backed, U.S.-backed pressure, it has not been able to meet the commitment that was made in 1997 to become part of China and to actually enforce the idea that there cannot be a secessionist movement inside of Hong Kong, given the colonial history and just the disaster that would bring to people in Hong Kong and China, and it would be also a global disaster in many ways.
So you're saying that because of they consider the Hong Kong protesters to be secessionist movement, that null and voids that, what is it called, the Basic Law? The Basic Law. That null and voids the Basic Law, which says Hong Kong has to make its own national security laws because there's secession happening. Is that, or did I hear you wrong?
No. China is actually attempting to help Hong Kong enforce the Basic Law. So the Basic Law gives Hong Kong Special Administrative Region the ability to legislate its own affairs, but it also has a commitment to remain within the Chinese constitutional authority, and those two things have to be balanced at all times. So this has absolutely no bearing over the economy. Most people in Hong Kong will not be affected by this new legislation that is coming out. What Beijing is trying to do is work with the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region to enforce the Basic Law, to keep it strong, because in the Basic Law, it states specifically, Article 23, that there cannot be a secessionist, a separatist movement This is I think it's important to compare what is happening in Hong Kong to what happened in Ukraine. The NED helped back these far right, very fascistic forces in Ukraine to overthrow the government. And what's very important to understand, too, is that the Azov Battalion, this far right, fascistic, neo-Nazi paramilitary organization, actually went to Hong Kong to express its solidarity with the protesters. Now they're a part of the Ukrainian defense system after the overthrow. So the Azov Battalion, members of that fascistic organization, have been to Hong Kong to express their solidarity with this organization. So it's really important to note that the NED has a similar agenda in Hong Kong as it has anywhere else, and that this is the principal reason why these protests exist, and it's the reason why China is responding in the way it has. We also have to understand that China is really responding to a piece of legislation passed in November of 2019, which was allowed to be lobbied by people like Martin Lee, Joshua Wong, Jimmy Lai, these NED-backed forces. They came to Congress, lobbied every single senator and a member of the House. This includes our faves, Bernie Sanders, AOC. They voted for the Human Rights Democracy Act, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act of 2019. And that act gave the U.S. the legislative authority to sanction China. And it also strengthened sanctions against the DPRK, North Korea, and Iran vis-a-vis regular meetings that the president and Congress have to have now to ensure that Hong Kong isn't used as a route to bypass those sanctions against those countries. So, this was an act of war, not only to China, but also to Iran and the DPRK. And China is responding to the fact that the U.S. government is outwardly showing support and saying that they are going to back these forces and ensure that these right-wing protesters come to, power, not only in Hong Kong, but also to threaten China, because we're talking about China, too. Hong Kong is a part of China legally as well as historically.
So you're saying that most of the people in Hong Kong aren't pro the protesters. That's what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. Yes.
And that most of the people in China would like to be welcome what's happening with China right now, this new rule.
I would say that the vast majority of workers in Hong Kong very much do not want to go back to, even if they have differences with the Chinese central government, they do not want to go back to the colonial period, which is what so-called autonomy, independence from China would bring, because we're not just talking about Hong Kong being some free state, right? We're talking about Hong Kong would be basically an outpost of the United States, which it has served de facto for many years since 1997, since the one country, two systems law. But this would become even more problematic, not only for China, but for the world, because you would have another U.S. imperial outpost in East Asia. This is part of a larger agenda. I mean, we're talking about hostilities that are just increasing by the day with China on the part of the U.S. military state.
Right, yeah. So Obama started the thing called the pivot to China, and now people don't realize that 55% of our naval reserves are in the Pacific, and that's part of this. Now, and so I keep thinking, so they're getting ready to go to war with China? Is that really that seems crazy, right? To me, it does, but I didn't know that they were petitioning the United States to actually come to Hong Kong and help secure their independence. Let me, now you keep referring to that there's right-wingers in China. Now, I get these things confused because I always think of authoritarians as being right-wingers. But there's also authoritarian left. Now, would you consider that China would be the authoritarian left, or what would you, are they just authoritarian state capitalists, or what are they?
What is the character of the central government?
Yes.
Or yeah. So, China is it's important. I feel like authoritarian is often used as a way to kind of smear leftists and to smear revolutionary socialists, socialist states, especially Cuba, Venezuela. We can go down the line. So in terms of how I would characterize China is what it has been since 1949. It is what they call a democratic people's dictatorship, a dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, it's not the same as it was in 1949. I think the opening up and reforms has definitely meant that China has become more of a mixed economy, where socialist state planning ultimately has principal authority, but that the market is allowed to operate, the private capital is allowed to operate in China, and actually accounts for a lot of economic growth. However, the commanding heights of the economy, like transportation, communications, energy, those and land, all reside under the state sector. So, in a sense, I would say that China is a mixed economy, but it is very much so a socialist state. They call it socialism with Chinese characteristics. Socialism being the central authority of the state, and then Chinese characteristics being integrating the market in a way that fits the conditions of China and allows the market to operate as a engine of growth, which it has done. It's not perfect. I think when I spoke to you at our last live stream, it's important to understand that not even the central government, not even the NPC, all the way down to the local authorities, believe that the Chinese system of socialism is perfect. They specifically say, and this is a point of unity across China, they're in the primary stage of socialism, which means that they're using the market and they're doing whatever they can to get out of the utter poverty. I mean, in 1978, there was less than one telephone per 1,000 in the population, less than one car per 1,000 in the population. The average annual income was less than per capita GDP, I should say, not annual income, but per capita GDP was barely $100. So we're talking about a very poor country as of 1978. And so China is very much aware, the central government as well as the population, that their system is not perfect, that there are contradictions in the policies that they enact, that there are problems with instituting the market and allowing it to fester in China, but that it does serve a purpose. And so it's about balancing the goals. And balance is a huge part of what China does, both domestically and abroad, trying to ensure the interests of the Chinese people are safeguarded, as well as ensure that it is not, doing harm to the people's interests in its dealings abroad as well. So it's a very complex system, but really, I think our principal stance should be around China, that the Chinese people should be managing the affairs of their government and their system, and that people in the United States have the obligation to defend China from U.S. aggression, which I believe wholeheartedly, 100%, all of the dealings in Hong Kong are about advancing U.S. aggression towards China through a proxy war.
So, would it be fair to say then most of the people in the Chinese government are leftists?
I would say that.
Is that what you would say? What would you say?
It's complex because China is a very ideologically diverse country. Even the Chinese Communist Party is a very ideologically diverse party. Right. So there are many different ideologies in China. Well, there are neoliberals in China. There are people who are, it's a mix. I would say the Chinese Communist Party itself is a mix of ideologies. There are people who consider themselves Maoists. There are people who consider themselves more along the lines of Deng Xiaoping and the opening up of the country. There are folks that consider the need to integrate all of it. Xi Jinping, the current president, that's his principal line, is integrating both the opening up as well as the Mao period into a concrete ideology and a policy framework for the country. So I would say it's a very diverse political system. The population has a very diverse political outlook. So it's hard to really export ideas of left in the United States and the Western world, especially to China, because it has a different experience given
Well,
its relationship to the world and
The reason I
politics,
ask you that in that way, if there's that many leftists in China, who picks up the restaurant tabs? Come on. Come on.
I didn't even get that one.
Come on.
Right over my head, Jimmy. Right over my head.
Come on. That's because I'm going to guess he's one of those lefties.
Dead Street. Constantly
al-
Dead Street.
Always splits the check.
Yeah.
That's what I'm going to guess.
Oh, there's 5 of us. Let's split it.
See, I just outed you. Danny's one of those lefties. Doesn't pick up the check.
You should all be happy to know he's still controversial.
And he's still controversial. All right. So just to recap, everyone else in the Western media is saying this is the end of Hong Kong. It's all over in a very, it's in a pejorative way, in a negative way. It's not good. But you're saying, no, it actually is good. And don't worry about it. And the people in Hong Kong are actually not as protest as the Western media portrays it to be.
Yeah, I would say Hong Kong is also a very diverse region of China. It's really inflicted with inequality. And I would say that there are very diverse opinions about these protesters. I would say that this law, even though it is not really going to affect Hong Kong's relationship to China, this new legislative approach that the central government is taking is not going to affect the one country, two systems policy at all. What it will do, though, and this is very important to note, and this is why the U.S. is so angry, why The Guardian, I'm not surprised The Guardian is very angry about this, is that it does mean that people like Joshua Wong, people like Jimmy Lai, people like Martin Lee, that they're going to have a lot harder of a time being able to use their resources from the U.S., the NED, et cetera, to push forward this separatist agenda and to push forward this destabilization campaign. What they're so scared of.
What is it going to do specifically to people like that? How will it make it harder? What will it do?
Well, I think it's not so clearly, and this is what is very important to also note, is that all of this hysteria and this panic, this is all still going to be discussed. It's still being discussed as we speak. But what it will principally do is it will give the Chinese central government the authority to basically say to the Hong Kong legislative authorities that these protesters cannot be allowed to achieve their agenda. It doesn't mean freedom of assembly is gone. It doesn't mean that these rights that are enshrined, these bourgeois rights that are enshrined in Hong Kong's basic law are gone. What it means is that the basic law is actually being enforced because this separatist movement is not going to be allowed to achieve what it is achieving. So what that will look like, unclear, given that, we've been amid a pandemic for so long and that these protests have largely gone away. But it does mean that the NED especially will be under more surveillance, probably, that there will be more pressure to ensure that this organization is not able to dictate politics in China, in Hong Kong. So I think that's what's really making the U.S. and Western imperialists in the corporate media so scared, is because, their interests are on the line. And they say it in the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act of 2019. They say it in this article that they are frightened about what this means for U.S. and Western interests specifically.
Hey, this is the part where I tell you where our live shows are, but there aren't any. And then I would tell you to go join our premium, but nobody has a fucking job. So why don't you just enjoy the video?